the Masculinity Unmasked podcast with hosts Max Wilson and Greg Stein.
Okay, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Masculinity Unmasked, the fortnightly conversation that delves deep into what it means to be a man in the 21st century. So, the topic of conversation for today is from crisis to connection, navigating relationships as a modern man. And as always, I'm joined by my co host and fellow coach, Greg Stein.
Hi,
Greg.
Max. How's it going?
Good, thanks. And this evening, we're also lucky to be joined by Puya Delavar, who is a relationship crisis coach. So, Puya, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Do you want to start by sharing a little bit about your story and the work that you do now?
Absolutely. Thanks, Max, Greg, both of you. Great to be on the show. It's wonderful to be here. And I think this topic is fantastic. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you guys. My story. So as you mentioned, I'm a relationship crisis coach and I help men who want to basically preserve what's most important to them, which they one day realize, which is their relationship. Sometimes that involves kids, sometimes not. But basically, they want to avoid divorce. And the reason I got into this is because I personally went through a crisis myself just over 10 years ago. I didn't want to lose my marriage. I was in a very dark place, which I was lucky enough to be able to get myself out of. And that process of getting myself out of that difficult phase of my life taught me so much because I actually started going on a research, read books, spoke to experts. So I put together something that worked for me. A lot of my colleagues and friends came in and said, okay, Puya, how did you save your relationship? Because we want to do the same, because this I found out was actually a problem that a lot of men faced, that we weren't equipped enough to be able to know what we need to do in order to save our marriage or relationship. So I ended up helping others. And about a year and a half ago, I decided to leave the corporate world and decided to make this my mission. So I've been helping men ever since, mostly men, to be able to save their relationship.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that and your own parts of your own personal story there. And I'm sure a lot of those things will resonate with some of our listeners here today. I'm sure that's something that we'll unpack as we go on as well. I think one of the misconceptions out there is that there is this thing that's a successful relationship, this aspirational state in a relationship that we should all be trying to obtain. Actually, that is a misconception, isn't it? And so I'm curious as to your sort of take on that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, that is actually a misconception that I personally had myself, and that ended up me in a difficult situation. So I believe we have a set of programming that we might not necessarily be aware of that dictates our actions. So we think, okay, my life should look like this, my relationship should look like this. There shouldn't be any arguments. That is a first misconception. Anyone who has arguments, difficulties in a relationship, they must have a bad relationship. So they think of a good relationship one where there isn't any conflict, but that is so far from the truth. The best relationships that I've seen that actually work together is where there is conflict, of course, because that is natural, but is a conflict that both parties manage to resolve together in the best possible way. And in order to do that, we need to have a set of tools and understand ourselves. And this is where I help people to get to know themselves so that they can see, okay, in which situations do they react a certain way that come across negative, or in which situations do their partner say one thing and they take it the wrong way. So all of these tools help people understand what constitutes a successful relationship. So we want to avoid thinking that, it's got to be a smooth ride and that is what a successful relationship, or we need to have things in common with our partner. No, absolutely not. One thing we need to have is the right mindset, the right knowledge about ourselves, about communication. And that's how we can make a successful relationship, regardless of what situation or what state we're in at the time.
Really, really interesting. And this makes me think about, what people think about being a picture perfect relationship. We live in a world where social comparison theory is everywhere, Instagram, social media, Hollywood, everything, Where do you think these ideals are built? Is it from, when you're younger? We talked earlier about looking at your parents, but how do you think people build up these ideals of that picture perfect relationship?
That's actually a really good question. So we're born as a blank slate. Everything that we are right now is a result of everything that we've been exposed to from when we were born until now. And that's that's how we build an idea of what we expect from a relationship, from a business, from ourselves, from health, and a number of other things. The very first, and this is, I think, what you touched on earlier, the very first relationship we have after we're born is with our parents. So that itself plays a huge part on what we think is correct, is the right expectation that we should have of what a relationship is. And these are shown very clearly with statistics. So for example, I come from a broken family. My parents got divorced. So I wanted to make sure that that doesn't happen with my own family. But then I looked into statistics, and it basically stated that children who are from separated or rather divorced parents are 50% more likely to get divorced themselves from their own marriage. And the reason for that is because these are the dynamics that we're exposed to. So we see that and we think, okay, well, that's normal. So when we enter a relationship, this is the programming we have. And we have a different expectation level than someone who's been brought up in a marriage that maybe the parents stayed together, because the dynamics they've seen work are very different. So what we learn and what we expect and what we want is very much dictated by what happened in our past. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. It sort of links to what we were chatting about before we came on to talk today. This idea that we move from relationship to relationship, expecting to create that normal for ourselves. And that normal could look very different to other people's normal, right? Depending on our attachment style, for example, when we're young, or adaptive behaviors, for example, people pleasing, rescuing, hyper independence. And so if we're not doing any rewiring, if we're not doing any reprogramming on those patterns, then we end up in that sort of default state in every relationship that we're in, right? And that can create real problems, as I understand it.
And the other issue that we have right now, of course, is we're exposed to so much in social media. So this creates also an unreal expectation of what we think a relationship should be like. So we see all these picture perfect couples living this absolutely beautiful, happy life. And we have no idea what goes on behind these pictures, behind the scenes, what kind of arguments they have, or what kind of agreements or arrangements they have together. So typically, what I normally say is, there's a saying, comparison is the theft of joy. It really is like that. So when we compare our own relationship to someone else, or we think, okay, well, why don't I have this? Or why can't I have a wife or husband like that? That automatically puts us in a situation where we're already damaging our own relationship because we think of what we don't have, rather than we thinking, okay, what is it we have? And then try to work on making sure that we have the best version of the relationship that we're already in.
Yeah.
Max, is really interesting to hear you talk about attachment theory. We're all a product of our environment, aren't we? So an interesting point you talked about, when we're younger, we have a clean slate and we learn and learn and learn. And then that creates these fearful, avoidant attachments, etc., etc. Well, for the people that are listening, like I do a little bit of relationship coaching myself. I know this is common. Is there any take homes, any great advice that you can give to the listeners who are dealing with this in a relationship? And on either side of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you talked about attachment styles. And I think it's important for us to be at least aware of what kind of attachment style we have. So just to very briefly talk about these 4 attachment styles, the most common one is the secure one. So we have secure attachment style. That's someone who is generally comfortable with themselves. They're not in any way hung up on anything specific that would cause a negative situation in their relationship. So the secure is one of them. One is dependent. This is someone who typically, so in a relationship, what I've seen typically is one side is more afraid of losing the other person, and the other person is more afraid of losing themselves. So they are worried about losing their independence or their character. So the one who's worried about losing the other person is the anxious attachment style, and the one who's worried about losing themselves is the avoidant. So avoidant is the third attachment style. And the last one is the mixture of avoidant and anxious, which creates a complex situation. So it's important to understand where you are with this. And I generally don't typically like to pigeonhole absolutely everything, because everyone is unique and we all have our own personality. But what I'm trying to get with this point is it's important to know ourselves. It's important to understand what triggers us, what makes us behave a certain way, and what are our likes and our dislikes. And we talked about the past, and that past plays a huge part on what we're like. So this self-awareness already is the very first step for us to work on a good relationship. And that obviously takes work, but I think before that happens, we can't expect anything good to happen in our relationship in terms of there's a healing or progress.
Yeah. So it's a common theme in all of the episodes we've had, and certainly in my coaching work as well. It's always everything starts with self-awareness, right? Self-awareness, and then we can take action. It's the same in relationships. You said something really interesting at the beginning around conflict resolution, which seems to flow from this conversation of these attachment styles. It's inextricably linked to it, which is, we are different. Yeah, we're two different people coming into a relationship, and just by virtue of that difference, there is going to be conflict. And you hit the nail on the head, I think, from what I understand as well, in terms of it's not that we're trying to avoid conflict. Conflict is actually a healthy part of relationships because it's working through things, but it's the conflict resolution, which is the real indicator of a successful relationship. How do we move through the conflict, not whether we have the conflict? And I think it might be interesting to begin to shine a light on that in terms of, okay, well, we're met with conflict in the relationship. What can we do about that that's actually constructive? So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the questions that I ask every single person that I work with. And I think you really, like you said yourself, you hit the nail on the head. This is so important to understand. How do we resolve conflict? What is the nature of the conflict? So it can be quite complex, but the first thing that I do is try to remind people to look at it differently. When we have an argument, which is unavoidable in a relationship, there are bound to be arguments because, exactly like you said, we're different characters, we have different pasts, we have different expectations. We enter this thing with a whole set of different wishes and lists that we have and expectations that we want the other partner to have and do, and they're not always met. And actually, there's rarely met, all of them. So if we do that, how do we deal with it? So the very first step, I would say, if you're about to enter a relationship, and this is obviously for anyone who's young or in a new relationship, is be aware of your expectations, express them, put them out on the table and say, and sounds easier than done, but it plays a huge part on how the rest of your relationship moves on. Put them on the table and say, these are my expectations. This is what I expect to happen in our relationship. When later on, if that expectation isn't met, at least you've discussed it. You know what the other person, where you stand with the other person, and the other person also knows about you. And if you have that exchange very early on, that is already the very first, most healthy step you can have in a relationship. But when it comes to relationships that are older, at any time, if you still have that expectation, it's important to be aware of it. So I digress. So the other thing that I think is important to have in a relationship is understand what is the underlying factor for your discussions, for your arguments. And I can go on for a while, but typically what we have is 3 needs that we all have in a relationship. And if any of those needs aren't met, that results in a discussion, in an argument. But we're not aware of these needs. What we need to do is understand with every single argument, with every single conflict, to literally peel the layers off and look at that underlying need that isn't met and understand what is triggered us for us to be unhappy with a specific situation. That is something that I obviously work with my clients with. We take every single argument that they have, typical ones and rare ones, and we literally strip them of all the surface, superficial factors that we think are the reasons, and look at the underlying factor of what has triggered us in the first place. I'll talk about these needs if you want to, but the main thing is to understand when we have a conflict, what is it that you're fighting for rather than what is it you're fighting about? And that immediately changes your perspective on why you're doing this. If you don't understand, you just go into this on a reactive mode, and all you're doing is like 2 knights with a shield and a sword. You're just battling each other, and you're trying to protect yourself against the other person's accusations while you yourself are trying to attack. And that obviously doesn't end up with anything constructive. What you need to do is understand, what are you fighting about? And then automatically you realize you actually have something in common. And that puts you on a very different mindset. And most of the time, like you yourself said, you look at the resolution rather than the fact that you're actually fighting.
Yeah. Just to cover that off, Puya, what are the 3 needs?
Sure. Okay. So the 3 needs in any relationship, the first need is that we want to feel connection. Now, What that means is intimacy. We need to feel that we're taken care of by the other person. We need to make sure that the other person cares for our well-being. And this need for connectedness is extremely important. Now, this represents itself differently in different relationships because some people translate that, from either sex, doesn't make a difference, to a physical intimacy need, or an emotional intimacy, or the presence of someone, but that connection is important. So the need for feeling cared for is the very first need. The second need is that we need to feel that we are being fairly treated. So, which means that our priorities are as important to our partner as our partner's priorities to us, and that our advice is as important. So, if I'm, for example, I'm making an example just to make that easier. If we have my wife and I have a fight about how to bring up the kids, we need to understand that I'm not just going to just listen to whatever she says, or vice versa, because our upbringing are as important in terms of priority as each other's. If one person feels that their priorities are always worth less than the other, then this discrepancy creates a problem. Then you always feel like, well, I'm not taken seriously enough. I don't seem important enough. My priorities don't matter to my partner as much. So that's one need that needs to be met. You need to feel that we fairly treated. And the other one is we need to feel valued. I need to feel as if I am as important in my partner's eyes as my partner is important in my eyes. So, for example, if I have an opinion about, I don't know, making decisions about meeting in-laws without consulting my partner, I'm basically saying, I make the decisions here. So my decisions here are worth more than yours. And again, this creates a discrepancy and an unfairness. And if we feel that we're being unfairly treated, then we feel as if that we're not as peers as our partner is. Just to give you an example, and this is a funny one, I've actually met couples where the wife has, in public, so we were having a barbecue, and the wife referred to the husband as her third child. And that basically takes off all these. So not only do you not feel as a peer, you don't feel valued, and you don't feel unfairly treated, you don't think care that you're careful. So everything needs to be on equal terms in that sense. Your worth, your value, your opinions, your frame of mind, and everything. And at the same time, you want to make sure that you're valued and that you're cared for by your partner. So if any of these three, or a combination of these three, isn't met, without realizing it, we create a resentment, and that then manifests itself in one way or another to an argument. So we might just lash out at our partner because we're upset about, I don't know, because she left the towel on the floor while it was wet. He didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher in the right way. It could be anything. That isn't really the problem. We need to go deep and understand what is the underlying factor for every single time we get angry. And then we understand, okay, if this need isn't met, then we sit down with our partner and we talk about it. And that is the best way to resolve it. So you get to a situation where you feel as if every single discussion you have with a partner is constructive. And that will make a huge amount of difference to your relationship.
Well, I was absolutely blown away by that in Glued. One thing that blows me away is I can see just how passionate you are about talking about that. And it makes me think of narrative identity, where you can't lead others down a line if you haven't walked it yourself. We're all coaches here for a reason. I'm here as a coach because I went for a failed breakup, and it broke my heart, and someone took me from rock bottom. That inspired me to help others. I was coach. I'd love to know a little bit more about you. What inspired you to take this step? What inspired you to have this transformation, and speak so passionately about this subject?
That's nice that you say it's passionate. Yeah, I hope I come across that way, because I really am, because I've seen what difference that makes in people's lives, not only in the partner, but the most important, in the children's lives. I've seen the difference, and this is why I think it's really important for us to pay a bit more attention to this. And also the fact that we seem very ill prepared to enter into a relationship. It seems like this is the stuff that we should be taught in school, because it affects all our lives, but we're not. We learn geography and history and all these useless stuff that we never use in our lives. But when it comes to something as important as relationship and the basics of it, we're not. In any case, so Greg, it's interesting you say that. I mentioned I went through a crisis myself just over 10 years ago. So my wife and I were married. Our first kid was born. I had a fairly good job. I was working in investment banking. I'm very ashamed of that, to be honest, because I hate that industry. But in any case, so there was one day where I was just staring out the window and I realized that I feel extremely unhappy, even though my life felt as if it's picture perfect. I have a beautiful wife. My daughter was born. I don't have any real tangible problems that I could put my finger on, but I just felt so empty inside. And I was just unhappy with everything that was going around. Part of it was the wrong programming that had led me to believe this is the kind of life I should be leading. So that discrepancy between what actually was fulfilling me and what I was doing in my life was causing this problem. And it was causing a health issue in me. And of course, it had a very negative impact on my relationship. So I almost got a divorce. We all separated, even though our first kid was born. So in any case, I remember the evening, actually, I went to a doctor. I was getting ill a lot because of that depression that I have. So I went to the doctor, and the doctor said, I recommend, and I put it in the system, that you should definitely quit your job. And I thought, she's crazy. How can I quit my job? Who's going to support the family? And I have responsibilities. So I went home and told my wife, and I expected her to say, yeah, what is she thinking? Instead, she said, yeah, she's absolutely right. I don't recognize you anymore. And that was such a slap in the face for me. And it was so unexpected. I realized I need to do something different. Unless I'm going down the path of divorce and I'm going to lose possibly custody of my kids, and I'm going to lose my wife, which I really didn't want to because I come from a broken family myself. I need to do something different. So I looked at my life and I decided I need to take a break, step back, look at my life and do something different. And that's what got me into this research of finding out what constitutes a real connection with a partner, what makes a real relationship work. So I've been working on that ever since. I'm happy to say, obviously, it works for me. So we stayed married. Our second kid was born, and we're still together. And what happened was, this was not my field. I was in business relationship management in the past, but what that involves actually is a lot of behavioral psychology. It's important to understand people, what makes someone tick, what makes them motivated. And that played a part into me understanding how that then translates into a romantic relationship. But of course, when I started researching this, I realized how much I didn't know. So I started thinking, okay, well, what do I need to do now? I need to go counseling. All of that, I'm sorry to say, was totally useless because it just seemed so superficial. It didn't seem tailored enough to my situation. So I was desperately trying to find someone who is able to then guide me and say, okay, well, this is what you need to pay attention to. This is what you need to do differently in order to make this work. And I couldn't find anyone. So I decided to be that person myself. So I started researching that ever since. So over a decade of reading books and talking to people and listening to talks. And when it worked for me, I wrote everything down, and people came to me and said, okay, what did you do, Puya? Because, I'm going through a crisis myself. Can you help me? So I helped people ever since. And this was just colleagues and friends that I was in touch with. And about 1 year and 2 years ago, I would say, I left the corporate world and I decided that since this is working for me and I've seen the results, I want to put all of my attention and energy into making this my mission. And this is basically it.
Story. Amazing story.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of sort of high achieving men in your position would be able to relate to that, Puya, and the steps that you took there, really, really helpful, I think. And just explaining as well, just as you did before that, the sort of underlying needs that aren't met in a relationship, giving people a framework to actually use, because there is limited information out there, and if you're stuck in that relationship rut, it's useful to have frameworks. And so I think as we begin to come to a close, it might be useful for all of us to sort of share practical tips for our listeners who may be in that situation, who want to move forward in their relationships. They may be feeling stuck in a rut. Things that they can do, steps that they can begin to take. Obviously, talking to yourself is a great one, but maybe some people aren't ready for that yet. So what steps can they be taking from a practical perspective? Do you have any sort of quick tips as we come to a close today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, actually. So I've put together a document that is actually free to download. If anyone is interested, we can give a link to that. And there's 5 typical pitfalls that high achieving men typically fall into. And I can briefly talk about those. One is that we think because we do really well at work, that we do the same at home. And what will actually happen is that we put all our energy in work, and then we come home and we're drained and we have nothing left for our partner. And that we don't realize we do that, but it has an impact obviously on our relationship. So if we balance that out, that automatically makes a difference. One is that because of what we do, this lack of attention, our partner actually feels as if we're the last thing on their mind, that they don't realize that how much they're worth to us. And it comes back to one of those needs not being met. So it's important for us to be aware of that and actually intentionally make conscious decisions to communicate that, the worth and how much they're important to us. The next one is the fact that this is a typically man thing, we come across as too cold, even though we might not feel that way inside, but our exposure might be too stoic, or our behavior just comes across as we don't care. That is something we need to be aware of. And for us to, again, put intention into that, and every now and then make time to actually do something that shows appreciation. Another one is that we typically measure the wrong metrics. We think everything's okay, we haven't had an argument, there's nothing big happening, so everything must be okay. And that is again another mistake that we typically make, because we think of the wrong metrics. We need to every now and then intentionally go and just check in, just to ask, how's your week been? How's your month been? What's going on in your life? If we don't intentionally do that creates, again, a problem. And the last one is that we typically, especially with people in a high position in their careers, we wait until there's a crisis. We don't realize then it's too late sometimes. Or we always say it's always better to avoid fires rather than put them out, because then you have to build up again from scratch. So we need to be aware of this and not wait until the situation has already hit a crisis. So if we can be aware of steps we can take now, we should absolutely do it before things get bad.
Wow.
Yeah, some really great practical tips there. And it's funny, isn't it? Because we have meetings at work throughout the week, but we don't tend to have meetings in our relationships. A quick sit down, a check-in on a weekly basis, saying, something you appreciate about your partner, but also something constructively that you want to work on, and a solution of how you wish to work on that with them. And if we just did that, we wouldn't be in a situation where we have these fires around us. And I would just share as well, just something that was shared with me once, which was really powerful, which is non-violent forms of communication. So in terms of the way that we're having these conversations, something that can be really useful is just using the term "I feel," which takes responsibility of your story, or the story I'm telling myself is, rather than "you did this, you did that." Because like Puya was saying earlier, just holding up shields. Then your job in a relationship is to work as a team. It's not to be battling against each other. You're trying to work together to make this work as a project. So that's the one thing I would add. And assumptions are the termites of relationships. Let's not assume what other people are thinking. Let's actually check in with them and see whether that is the case. Greg, did you have anything you wanted to share before we finish up?
Yeah, I've just got one perspective I would like to ask you. I do a little bit of relationship coaching myself. You'd be so surprised how many couples have arguments over text messages. And you have to remind them, actually, there's many different layers and levels to communication, isn't there? Where text messages are almost like bottom level, entry level, if you like, but then there's voice notes, talking, meeting up, dating, etc., etc., etc. I advise everyone to keep those text message discussions at very low level. It's just a quick hack, isn't it? But that's also something for the workplace. Puya, do you have anything along that lines? Any sort of like quick hacks or take homes that our listeners can use?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love both of your points are fantastic. And what you mentioned, Max, is what I call the power of the eyes, seeing things from your own perspective rather than just saying, throwing accusations. So that's powerful. Very good. The other thing you mentioned about making meetings, I recommend actually schedule as if you're scheduling a meeting with your partner. Say on Wednesday, 8:00, we are meeting for half an hour, or we're going on a day, schedule it. Because then you're going to meet it as if you're meeting a meeting at work. What you mentioned, Greg, is also very great, very good. It's so important to be present. We're doing this online, but at least we see the visuals, the facial expressions. It makes a huge difference if you're there, if your presence, the energy you bring to the conversation. So I would say absolutely avoid communicating by text. At least if you can, meet online visually. If not, face to face. That is the best. That makes a huge difference on how much you can resolve things between you two.
Yeah. Great tips, and already helpful, I'm sure, for the listeners. So we could go on and talk about this even more depth today. There's so much more that we could say, and I will be signposting people to your programs, to your website in a moment. But I just wanted to say to you both, thanks so much for delving into the topic. It has been really, really great to get stuck in with this. And whilst we've only touched the surface, I think there are a lot of good take home. So, Puya, what's the best place for people to be able to get in touch with you and with your programs, to download the PDF? Obviously, we're going to attach some information to the show notes as well, but what's the best place to find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, so people can find me on LinkedIn, Puya Delavar, of course. I also have a website, puyadelavar.com, so it should be fairly easy to find me. Just send me a message, send me an email, and if you want to send me an email, the contact details are on the website, but in case, it's just puya@puyadelavar.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, if this topic resonates with anyone, which I'm sure it will, in fact, I'm sure it will resonate with most people, or you have ideas in relation to the next topic, please do get in contact with us. We always like hearing from you. And our next chat will be with leadership coach Steve Barrett in a couple of weeks' time on the 18th of May. And we'll be talking from chaos to culture, leading without losing ourselves. So thanks again, both, and take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Max. Thank you.
Take care.